Kandahar Giant, a war zone Bigfoot. 2 soldiers swear they shot dead in October of 2001, less than a month after the September 11th attacks. The United States and a coalition of its allies invaded Afghanistan. One of the first footholds coalition forces took was Kandahar International Airport, a facility on the southern plains of the country that the United States itself had helped build back in the 1960s. By the spring of 2002, it was a coalition airfield, an island of fuel and concrete and radio chatter in the middle of some of the most unforgiving terrain on the planet. But then something bizarre happened. Sometime in 2002, in the mountains beyond that airfield, an American patrol stopped reporting in. They did not answer their scheduled check-ins. They went completely silent. And a trained unit going dark like that, all at once, with no warning and no noise, is not a thing that is supposed to happen. That silence is where this begins. What grew out of it is a story that has been told and retold for 20 years now on late-night radio in 2005. Again on that same radio on December 3rd of 2008, and then in a set of filmed interviews released in 2016. It has been told by a man who says he was a pilot. It has been told by a man who hid his name and disguised his voice and called himself only Mr. K. And it has been told by men who served in Afghanistan and swear they first heard it not as a rumor or a campfire legend, but in country. They heard it from their own interpreters who relayed it as something that had actually happened to American soldiers in those mountains. Not a story, not a myth, a fact. And the fact was this: the men sent to find that missing patrol followed it up into the mountains, to the mouth of a cave littered with bones and torn uniforms. And something came out of that cave to meet them. They described it as standing 12 to 15 feet tall, covered in a tangle of red hair, with 6 fingers on each hand and a double row of teeth. It killed one of them before they brought it down. And then they say the body was loaded onto a helicopter, flown off into the dark, and erased from every record the United States government will admit to holding. Now, I know a lot of you have heard some version of this story before. It has made the rounds for years. But stay with me, because there are facts buried in this case that most people skip right past. Small, specific, verifiable details that almost nobody puts together. And when you line them all up, they point at something a great deal stranger than the version you have heard. 3 accounts, 1 missing patrol, and a body the official record insists was never found in a war full of things that were never written down. To understand what these men say they found in that cave, we have to go back to the beginning. The war that began in late 2001 was, in its first years, a war about mountains and caves. The men the coalition was hunting did not hold cities. They held high ground, ravines, and the kind of cave systems that this part of the world has hidden people in for as long as there have been people to hide. If you remember anything from the early coverage of that war, you may remember the word Tora Bora, the cave complex where Osama bin Laden was believed to have slipped away into the mountains along the eastern border. Caves were not a metaphor in this conflict. They were terrain. They were objectives. Men went into them and did not always come back out. And that was true long before anyone said the word giant. Kandahar province sits in the south, a landscape of dust and rock and sudden brutal elevation. Soldiers who serve there have described parts of Afghanistan as feeling like a different planet. Mud huts scattered across nothing, mountains in every direction. Silence so total it had a weight to it. It is worth understanding just how empty parts of that country are because the story depends on it. There are valleys in those mountains that have never been mapped on foot by any outside army. There are cave systems that locals know and outsiders do not, carved by water and time into rock that has watched empire after empire come through and leave. Alexander the Great marched men through this region, so did the Persians and the Mongols and the British and the Soviets. Every one of them learned the same lesson the hard way, that the land itself keeps secrets and that things can disappear into it without explanation. The way the bizarre event started, at least from what we know, is with an ordinary Army infantry patrol working a section of the Kandahar mountain range in 2002. There was nothing remarkable about the assignment. Men went out into high country to check a position, to look for the people they were there to look for, and to report back. That last part is the part that matters, because at some point this patrol stopped reporting back. And I want to slow down here because the eeriness of this case is not in any monster yet. It is in the shape of the silence. There was no call announcing contact with the enemy. There was no burst of panicked radio traffic, no request for reinforcements, no flare, no firefight echoing off the rocks. A patrol that runs into trouble makes noise. That is what the radio is for. That is the entire point of carrying it. This patrol made no noise at all. It simply went quiet at a check-in time and stayed quiet. Anyone who has carried a military radio will tell you a unit suddenly going silent is usually one of two things. Either it is a radio problem, which tends to get sorted out fairly quickly, or it is something else, something harder to put a name to, because a whole unit dropping off the net at once and staying off it is the kind of thing that just does not happen very often. Enough time passed, enough men were unaccounted for. And eventually, the silence itself became the emergency, because there is a threshold past which an absence of information is more frightening than any report could have been. The Army decided this was serious enough to send in its best. They tapped a Green Beret team. Army Special Forces, the people you send when you do not know what you're walking into, and you need the people walking into it to be the hardest to kill men you have. I personally think that is the detail most people skip past too fast. Whatever happened to that first patrol, somebody up the chain looked at the silence it left behind and decided this was not a job for an ordinary search party. They sent the unit you send when the ordinary answer has already failed. No contact report, no distress call. A full patrol simply stopped answering the radio in mountains where caves have swallowed men for 1,000 years. What follows is the account given by the man called Mr. K, who said he was one of the Green Berets sent in. It is the fullest version of the story that exists, the one that eventually reached a wide audience. I am going to give it to you the way he gave it, and I am going to hold strictly to the details he actually described. The team flew out by helicopter to within roughly 4 kilometers of the missing patrol's last known position. When they touched down, there was nothing, no locals, no other troops, no sign of anyone at all, just the mud huts and the mountains and that planetary silence in every direction. They searched for days, and then they found a path, a winding goat trail climbing up the side of the mountain, and they followed it. And as they climbed, they began to find things. First, pieces of military equipment scattered across the rocks. Then shreds of uniform, torn fabric still carrying the unit patches of the men they had been sent to find. And then bone. Bone matter on the ground, too far off at first to identify, but unmistakably there, scattered near the dark mouth of a cave. The cave was large enough, Mr. K said, to hold the entire team. They prepared themselves the way you prepare when you have just found the remains of the last group that came this way, and they moved toward it. Mr. K said he saw movement first, a flash of something in the far back of the cave, beyond a crevasse in the rock that he could not cross. He started to raise his weapon. He was not fast enough. An enormous spear, a thing he described as a massive javelin, came out of the darkness and impaled the Green Beret standing next to him, a man known in every telling only as Dan. It struck him in full view of the entire team and threw him backward. And then, in the space of a few seconds, the thing that had thrown it came out of the cave. It cleared the crevasse that the soldiers could not cross in a single motion and stood out on the open plateau in front of them. Mr. K described a creature between 12 and 15 feet tall. A shock of wild red hair and a red beard falling past its shoulders, 6 fingers on each hand, 6 toes on each foot, a double row of teeth. It was dressed in animal skins, and it had just killed one of them with a spear. What happened next, Mr. K said, was not a battle in any clean sense. It was men emptying their weapons into something that would not go down. One soldier opened fire, then another, then the whole team, and still the thing came. They were carrying serious firepower, rifles chambered in rounds meant to stop vehicles, and it did not seem to matter. It was only when they shifted their aim to its head that it finally fell. By the accounts, the entire engagement, from the first shot to the silence after the last one, lasted about 30 seconds. 30 seconds, and Dan was dead, and the thing was dead, and a team of the hardest men the United States Army produces was standing on a plateau in Kandahar looking at a corpse that none of them had a word for. I want to be careful here because this is the part of the story that is easiest to get carried away with, and I'm not going to invent a single detail Mr. K did not give. He did not describe its face in fine detail. He did not narrate its eyes. What he gave was the red hair, the size, the extra digits, the double teeth, the spear, and the awful fact of how hard it was to kill. That is what I am giving you. The rest of the dark in that cave, he left dark. Sit with the picture for a second, because the men who tell it never quite get past it. A team of elite soldiers, the people you send when nothing ordinary will do, standing on a bare plateau at the roof of the world. One of their own dead at their feet with a spear through him. And in front of them, something 12 to 15 feet tall with red hair and 6 fingers and a double row of teeth that took the better part of a magazine each to put down. Whatever you believe about whether it happened, that is the image these men have carried for 20 years. A spear comes out of the dark and kills the man beside him. Then the thing that threw it follows. 12 to 15 feet of red hair and 6 fingers, and it does not go down easy. The story does not end with the giant on the ground. In some ways, that is where it gets stranger, because this is the point where a second, completely separate witness enters. A man who never met Mr. K and told his part of the story years earlier. By Mr. K's account, the team radioed for help, and what arrived was not what they expected. A helicopter came in and dropped netting and orders, the orders being to bundle the creature up. A larger aircraft followed to haul it out. The thing reeked, he said, like a mixture of skunk and a corpse that had been left out a long time. It took a great deal of effort to get the netting around it, and then it was lifted off that mountain and taken away. Now go back in time to before Mr. K ever spoke. Years before those 2016 interviews, a man who said he was a military pilot reached out to the author and radio host Steve Quayle. He said that he had been the one tasked with moving the body. The pilot's account is where some of the most specific and most haunting details come from, precisely because they sound like the notes of a man filling out paperwork. He said the body was too large for a standard 463-liter cargo pallet, a piece of equipment with fixed, known dimensions. It had to be loaded curled into a fetal position just to fit. From the size of the load and its weight, he estimated the creature stood somewhere between 10 and 12 feet tall and weighed in the neighborhood of 1,100 pounds. He described what he could see of it under a plastic tarp. A hand and a foot, each with 6 digits. Skin paler than he expected, though he allowed that death might account for that. And a smell he could not properly put into words, a dirty, musky, pungent thing that filled the aircraft. 2 men, years apart. One who said he killed it on a plateau, one who said he flew its body out under a tarp. Neither knowing the other, both describing the same impossible cargo, down to the 6 fingers and the smell. And then, in both versions, the erasure. Mr. K said the team was made to complete a standard after-action report, and then told the report was unacceptable and had to be rewritten, scrubbed of the giant, rebuilt to read like an ordinary skirmish with enemy fighters. They were made to sign non-disclosure agreements. Dan officially died some other way. The patrol was officially never found. The body officially never existed. The pilot said it was flown to a base and then onward by faster jet. To Europe in one telling, to Ohio in another, and after that, nothing. This is the beat the believers hold on to hardest, and I understand why. To them, the total absence of evidence is not the end of the story. It is the proof. If a thing like this were ever pulled out of those mountains, they argue, an absence is exactly what you would expect to find, because an absence is what a cover-up is for. Marzulli, the filmmaker who put Mr. K on camera, has never been shy about that argument. He has said outright that he believes the government has a vested interest in burying this, that if there are 15 and 18-foot beings on the earth, and the military has brought one down, the public has a right to know. He frames it as something larger than a single dead creature on a mountain. To him, it is a thread that, if you pull it, unravels the whole official story of what we are and where we came from. That is a heavy thing to hang on 2 anonymous witnesses, and I will come back to how much weight those witnesses can actually bear. But it is why, for the people who believe this, the silence is not an embarrassment. The silence is the point. If you have ever heard a story like this one from someone who served, or if you served yourself and heard it passed around a base in the dark, I genuinely want to know. Tell me in the comments where you heard it and who you heard it from. Part of what makes this case what it is how many people keep quietly saying the same thing, and this channel reads every one of those. If I stopped here, I would be doing exactly what the channels I do not respect do. I would be handing you the scary version and walking away before the hard questions arrive. So let's bring the hard questions in, because this case has real ones and you deserve to see them. Here's where the story actually comes from, told in order. The first public appearance traces to the researcher and author Steve Quayle, a man who has spent decades arguing that the giants of the Bible and ancient myth were real and physical beings. In late 2005, he said he received a letter from the pilot. On December 3rd of 2008, he returned to the radio program Coast to Coast AM, hosted by George Noory, and this time he brought the pilot on the air to tell it himself. Quayle later folded the account into a book, written as fiction, called Long Walkers. It matters where this story first surfaced, and I am not going to dress it up. Coast to Coast AM is the most famous late-night paranormal radio program in America, a place where for decades people have called in to talk about alien abductions and shadow people and things in the woods. It is built for exactly this kind of story. A skeptic would tell you fairly that a tale that debuts on Coast to Coast and gets a second win from a man who has built a career on proving the Bible's giants is a tale that should be treated with enormous caution. I agree with that skeptic. I am treating it with enormous caution. That is what this whole section is. There is one detail from those radio years that I find genuinely strange, and it cuts against the idea of a single tidy hoax. When the pilot was eventually put in contact with one of the alleged shooters from the base, the 2 men compared notes and realized they were not even talking about the same incident. They were describing 2 different giants recovered in 2 different places in Afghanistan. If you were fabricating one story, you would not casually multiply it into 2. That is the kind of wrinkle that does not help a hoax. It only makes the thing messier and harder to hold. The second layer is the soldier. In 2016, the filmmaker L.A. Marzulli released interviews with a man called Mr. K, who claimed to have been on the team. Marzulli noticed something he could not shake. Every single time Mr. K reached the moment of Dan's death, he came apart. He would choke up, go silent, sometimes hang up the phone entirely. Across every retelling, the grief landed in the same place. Marzulli admitted the man could have been a gifted actor. He also said the grief did not feel like acting. The third layer is the one that made a lot of people, myself included, look twice, because the story did not stay on the radio and it did not stay with the believers. It turned up among the people who were actually there. Men who served in Afghanistan, including some with serious special operations backgrounds, have said they heard this not from a website but from their own interpreters in country, who passed it along as something that had genuinely happened to American soldiers in 2002. That is a different kind of source than a late-night radio caller. When the story is circulating among the troops on the ground, told by the locals who were translating for them, it stops being easy to laugh off. And now the breaks, because when you lay the accounts side by side, they do not agree with each other on details that men who were really there should not get wrong. In the pilot's version, the soldiers involved were Marines. In Mr. K's version, they were Army Green Berets. Those are not interchangeable. They are different branches with different cultures who do not even use the same words for the same things. The pilot placed the event around 2005. Mr. K placed it in 2002. The pilot said the body was carried out on a CH-47 Chinook, a large twin-rotor helicopter. Mr. K's account described an aircraft like the MH-53 Pave Low. Those two helicopters do not look remotely alike, and a real pilot of all people should not confuse one for the other. In one telling, the body went to Europe, in another to Ohio. Then there are the objections from the people who would know. In 2016, the fact-checking outlet Snopes put the question directly to the Department of Defense. The answer was flat. They had no record of any Special Forces member being killed by a giant in Kandahar, and no record of any patrol vanishing the way the story describes. No soldier named Dan matches the account on the casualty rolls of that war. And when the team at another channel, the Lore Lodge, walked this story past an actual former Green Beret on a live stream, his verdict was blunt. He did not argue about whether giants can exist. He said the tactics were wrong, that the way these soldiers supposedly behaved is not how trained soldiers behave. Which brings up the objection I keep coming back to myself. If you are standing on a plateau with rifles powerful enough to punch through armor and the thing in front of you is armed with a spear, it has to be close to use. Why would anyone break cover and charge it? Why would a man with range and firepower close the distance on an enemy that cannot reach him? I am not going to pretend those problems are small. They are not. On the evidence alone, this is a story with no body, no photo, no document, two anonymous tellers who contradict each other, and a string of details that do not survive contact with people who know how the military actually works. That is the honest accounting. And if that were all there was, I would tell you to file it away as a war story that grew in the telling, and we would be done. Marines or Green Berets, 2005 or 2002, a Chinook or a Pave Low. The accounts break against each other on the details, and the Pentagon says there is no record at all. But there are a handful of threads in this story that I cannot cut cleanly, and I have tried. The first is the consistency of the thing itself. Strip away the helicopter types and the branch names and the dates, the details that men misremember or embellish, and look at what does not change from teller to teller, 12 to 15 feet tall, red hair, 6 fingers, 6 toes, a double row of teeth, a spear, and that smell, that specific awful blend of skunk and decay, mentioned by a pilot under a tarp. and a soldier on a plateau who never spoke to each other. People who invent stories tend to invent different monsters. The descriptions here, across people who had no reason to be coordinating, keep landing on the same strange, specific creature. And it is not a generic monster they keep landing on either. If you wanted to invent a giant, the easy invention is a big, hairy ape, a Bigfoot in a turban, the creature everyone already pictures. That is not what these men described. They described something with red hair and a red beard, with a double row of teeth, with 6 fingers and 6 toes, dressed in skins and fighting with a spear. Those are oddly specific, oddly consistent features, and they are not the features of the monster a lazy hoaxer reaches for first. The 6 fingers in particular keep recurring, from the soldier on the plateau to the pilot looking at a hand under a tarp. And there is no obvious reason and invented detail that Strange would survive intact across 2 separate tellers who never met. The second thread is the people who keep half confirming it. Anonymous, yes. Unprovable, yes. But interpreters in country relayed it to American troops as fact. Other men who served keep surfacing in comment sections and forums to say they heard it too, or worked alongside the unit that supposedly encountered it. The story keeps circulating among the one group of people who would actually know if a patrol had vanished in those mountains, and none of them seem in a hurry to call it nonsense. I personally think that is the part that will not let me close the file. Not because any one piece of it is strong, but because the same impossible thing keeps walking out of those mountains in the mouths of people who do not know each other and gain nothing by saying it. And then there is the third thread, and this is the one that genuinely raised the hair on my arms when I followed it, because it means the soldiers were not the first people to tell the story. Not by 1,000 years. Start with the locals. Long before American boots ever touched that ground, the people of these mountains had their own giant. In the regional folklore, it is sometimes called the devil giant, a towering guardian of the high country, tied in the old stories to caves and to sacred places, a being that punishes those who trespass where they should not. Afghan folklore is thick with such things, with the divs and the jinn, spirits said to dwell in ruins and in caves and in the desolate, empty heights. A monstrous giant in a Kandahar cave is not, it turns out, an American invention. It is an old Afghan one, wearing the clothes of a new war. Elders in villages near Kandahar have described the giant as old as the mountains themselves. A thing that guards the land and punishes those who disrespect it, sighted across generations near sacred sites and in times of upheaval. Whether or not you believe a word of that, notice what it means for our story. The soldiers, if they were inventing a creature the people who actually live in those mountains already had a name for. They did not import an American monster into Afghanistan. They described, knowingly or not, the one that was already there. Now go back further to one of the oldest and greatest works of literature this region ever produced. Around the year 1010, the Persian poet Ferdowsi completed the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, the national epic of the Persian world. And buried in that epic is a story I could not stop thinking about once I read it. In it, a king named Kaykavis marches his army into a demon-haunted mountain land called Mazandaran against every warning. And there, his army is ambushed and destroyed, the king and his men blinded and captured and taken down into the dark. The army goes silent, word reaches home, and the greatest hero of the age, a warrior named Rostam, sets out alone through the mountains to find them. His journey becomes a series of 7 trials, and the final and most terrible of them takes place in a cave. There, in the dark, Rostam confronts the chieftain of the demons. The Shahnameh calls it the Div-e-Sepid, the white demon, a being of enormous size and immense strength, pale and monstrous, lying in its lair in the mountains. Rostam fights it in the blackness of the cave, in what the epic frames as the hardest battle of his life. And at last, he kills it and takes its head. The details rhyme in ways that are hard to wave off. In the poem, the demon does not simply fight. It blinds the king's army, leaves them helpless in the dark, takes them down into a cave. The thing is described again and again by one feature above all others, its whiteness, its paleness, a color the old illustrators rendered over and over across centuries of Persian manuscript art, a massive pale figure pinned in a dark cave beneath the hero. And when it is finally dead, the victors carry a piece of it away as proof, a pale giant in a mountain cave, a lost army, a team sent to find them, a body taken away when it is over. This is a story this region has been telling and painting on the walls of its books for 1,000 years. Read that again and hold it next to the soldier's account. An army goes silent in the mountains. A team is sent to find them. They climb to a cave. And inside the cave waits a giant, pale and enormous, that has to be killed in the dark before the lost men can be answered for. 1,000 years ago, in this exact corner of the world, somebody already wrote the Kandahar giant. The names are different. The shape of the thing is identical. You can call that an archetype. You can say that human beings everywhere, across all of time, tell stories about heroes who go into caves to kill giants, and that two soldiers in 2002 simply reached, knowingly or not, for the oldest script there is. That is a perfectly reasonable thing to believe, and it might be exactly right. But there is one more thread, and unlike the folklore, this one is not a story. It is in a museum, just across the mountains from Afghanistan. In the deserts of Central Asia lie the Tarim Basin mummies. These are real, and you can go and look at them. They are the naturally preserved bodies of people who lived and died in the Bronze Age, some of them nearly 4,000 years ago, kept almost perfectly intact by the bone-dry air. And when they were studied, they turned out to be something the textbooks did not expect to find in that part of the world at all. Tall, fair-skinned, and in a number of cases, red-haired. There's a body they call the Chechen man, who died around 3,000 years ago and still has his red hair and full beard. There's a woman called the red-headed beauty of Hami. There's the beauty of Lulan, found lying on her side as though asleep. A tuft of red hair across her head and worn moccasins still on her feet, nearly 4,000 years old. These are not legends, and they are not blurry photographs. They are physical human remains, found in the dry dark of Central Asia, with red hair still on their heads after 3 millennia. When scholars first studied them, the findings were strange enough to set off political fights that are still going on, because these tall, fair, red, and blonde-haired people were buried in a part of the world the textbook said they had no business being in 1,000 years and more before the population's history expected. They had woven tartan-like cloth, they had European-looking features, and they had been swallowed by the dry ground and kept there, perfectly, hidden from everyone, for thousands of years until the desert gave them back. I want to be careful and clear, because this is exactly the place where a dishonest version of this story would lie to you. The Tarim mummies do not prove a giant. They are not 12 feet tall. They are ordinary-sized people, and there is nothing supernatural about them. What they prove is smaller and stranger than that. They prove that this region really did hold tall, red-haired people that the conventional map of history did not see coming, and that those people were buried in caves and graves in the dry ground and stayed there, hidden for thousands of years. The archetype the soldiers described did not come from nowhere. It has roots in real ground here. Red hair, in the dark, under the earth, in exactly this part of the world. That part is not a story. That part you can drive to. A king's army vanishes in the mountains. A team is sent to find them. In a cave waits a pale giant that must be killed in the dark. The Persians wrote it 1,000 years ago. So where does that leave us? The official record gives us nothing. No patrol was ever reported lost the way the story says. No body was ever acknowledged. No photograph has ever surfaced from a war in which nearly every soldier carried a camera. The Pentagon says flatly that there is no record of any of it. By every standard this channel normally lives and dies by, the case is empty. And yet the story will not stop walking out of those mountains. It walks out in the letter of a pilot who described a body too big for the pallet, loaded curled in on itself under a tarp. It walks out in the voice of a soldier who broke down weeping at the same moment in every single retelling, the moment his friend died. It walks out in the words of interpreters who told American troops it was simply true. It walks out of a 1,000-year-old poem about a hero who killed a pale giant in a mountain cave. And it walks out of the dry ground of Central Asia in the red hair of people who are not supposed to be there. I am not going to tell you what came out of that cave in Kandahar. I do not know. On the evidence, I cannot stand here and say a giant died on a plateau in 2002, and I will not pretend otherwise to give you a tidier ending than the truth allows. But I also cannot quite tell you it did not happen, because the thing about a war is that it is full of things nobody wrote down. And the thing about those mountains is that they are old enough to have buried far stranger stories than ours, and dry enough to keep them. And two men who never met, on the parts of their lives they could not get back, swore they saw the same impossible thing, and swore that the rest of us were never meant to hear about it. Somewhere out there, the official file is closed, and somewhere out there, in country we mapped with satellites and never once understood. The story is still being told in the dark, the way it has been told in that place for 1,000 years. I'll leave it to you to decide what they found. If this one got under your skin, you're going to want to see the story I am working on next, about a wealthy American who became so convinced that creatures like this were real that he spent a fortune mounting expeditions to find them in some of the same mountains, chasing some of the same legends. His name was Tom Slick, and his story is stranger than you would believe. That one is coming soon. Until then, I'm Alex. Stay curious and be careful what you go looking for in the dark.